Have you ever heard of kimono seirei? Kimonos made from human skin? I found this story on a Japanese horror forum, buried in an old thread with no title. The post was short. No explanations, no warnings, just a single line of text. If you ever find an old kimono with a pattern of red chrysanthemums, don't touch it. It wants your skin. No comments, no replies. But I checked the user's profile. They haven't logged in for 5 years. At first, I thought it was just another urban legend, but then I found something else. A real police report from a small Japanese town called Nagaoka. In 1932, a young woman was found murdered. Her skin had been removed, and beside her lay a kimono. Decades later, in the same town, a student named Mika Kawasaki disappeared without a trace. Her belongings were found in her hotel room. Everything was in place, except her. Now, this story belongs to you. Are you ready to wear the cursed kimono?
Mika Kawasaki had always been obsessed with the past. As a graduate student in traditional textile arts, she had spent years studying the intricate craft of kimono making. But books and lectures weren't enough. She needed something real, something ancient, something alive. That's why she came to Nagaoka, a quiet town where time itself seemed to hesitate. Her professor had mentioned a tiny antique shop rumored to hold kimono seirei, spirit kimonos, garments so old, so steeped in history, they were said to be cursed. Mika didn't believe in curses. She found the shop at the end of a desolate alley. The sign was half-rotted, the wood damp with years of neglect. The old man behind the counter barely looked up when she entered. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something fleshy. At first, nothing caught her eye. Then, hidden behind stacks of yellowed fabric, she saw it. A kimono unlike any other. Its silk was faded to the color of old bones. Crimson chrysanthemums curled along the edges, their petals dark as dried blood. The fabric seemed wrong, not silk, not cotton, but something with a strange, organic texture. She reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a breath, a faint, wet sigh, so close it felt like someone had exhaled against her ear. Mika yanked her hand back. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She turned to the shopkeeper.
How much for this one?
The old man's expression collapsed. His lips trembled. His throat worked as if trying to swallow a scream. Leave it. His voice was a raw whisper. That kimono is not meant to be worn. Mika hesitated. The fabric still felt warm on her fingertips. She bought it anyway. That night, in her tiny rented room, she couldn't sleep. The kimono lay folded on the chair, a pale, motionless thing in the dark. But the longer she stared, the more she was certain. It was breathing. Mika woke up to the feeling of warm breath on her face. Her body froze. The room was pitch black, silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. But someone, something, was there. A presence. Heavy, pressing, close. She inhaled, slow and controlled, straining her ears. Soft, rustling, like fabric shifting, like someone moving just out of sight. Her gaze darted toward the chair. The kimono was no longer folded. It lay crumpled on the floor, as if it had been worn, as if someone had stood up and let it slide from their body. A sharp, cold wave of nausea rolled through her.
Did I sleepwalk?
She didn't remember getting out of bed, didn't remember touching it. But there it was, closer to her than before. Mika swallowed hard and switched on the lamp. The warm glow pushed back the shadows, but it didn't bring comfort. If anything, the room looked smaller, the walls subtly wrong, like they were leaning inward. The kimono looked different now. The chrysanthemums were darker, fresher, their crimson petals no longer faded. And the fabric, was it smoother last night? The texture now seemed more supple. She reached down, hesitant, fingertips brushing the cloth. A wet, meaty squelch. Mika recoiled, bile rising in her throat. The fabric was moist. She yanked her hand back, heart hammering. There was something beneath the silk, something alive. Then, from the far corner of the room, where the light didn't quite reach, a whisper, low, breathy, close to her ear, though no one was there.
Give it back.
The lamp flickered, and in the mirror across the room, Mika saw what she never wanted to see. A girl stood behind her. Her hair was cut jaggedly at the shoulders, as if it had been hacked off. Her skin was peeled, raw in places, muscle and sinew visible beneath. And she was smiling, not at Mika, at the kimono, as if it belonged to her. And as Mika tried to scream, her throat closed. Mika bolted upright, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The girl in the mirror was gone. The kimono still lay on the floor, motionless. But Mika couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt wrong. The walls of the tiny room seemed to press in tighter. Even the lamp's glow seemed duller, as if the light itself was afraid to shine too brightly. She forced herself to move. Slowly, carefully, she picked up the kimono, her fingers trembling. It felt normal now, dry, smooth. But the memory of that wet, fleshy squelch wouldn't leave her mind. She shoved it into her bag. Whatever was happening, she wanted no part of it. The next morning, she made her way to the town archives, determined to uncover the kimono's origins. The streets of Nagaoka felt emptier than the day before. A few old women watched her pass, their lips pressed into thin, bloodless lines. She pretended not to notice. At the library, she spent hours digging through old records, newspapers, police reports, anything that might explain why this thing existed. And finally, she found it. A brittle newspaper, dated July 1932. The headline sent ice through her veins.
Local girl, found murdered, skin removed, body disposed of.
The name, Aiko Okuno, 19 years old. The article described how she had disappeared one night, only for her flayed corpse to be discovered days later, dumped near the town's outskirts. The police never found her killer. The only clue? A kimono found neatly folded beside her body. Mika's stomach twisted. She flipped to the next page, her eyes scanning for more details. And then, a photograph. Aiko Okuno, staring directly at the camera. Mika's breath hitched. The face was young, pretty, but the eyes, hollow, lifeless, and the hair, hacked off at the shoulders. Mika's vision swam. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to stay calm. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But then, a whisper.
Give it back.
Her eyes snapped open. The library was silent. The other visitors were far across the room, noses buried in books. No one was near her. No one had spoken. Her pulse pounded against her skull. She turned back to the photograph. Her stomach dropped. Aiko's mouth was open now. It hadn't been open before, and the longer Mika stared, the wider it stretched. A silent, gaping scream. Mika slammed the newspaper shut. Her breath came in rapid, uneven gasps. Her hands shook, fingertips numb. It had to be a trick of her mind, a glitch in the old photograph. It couldn't have changed. She forced herself to look again. The paper was still closed. She didn't dare open it. Grabbing her bag, she stumbled out of the library, her body moving on instinct. The streets blurred past her. The whispers from the night before clawed at the edges of her thoughts, but she pushed them down, focused on one thing. She had to get rid of the kimono, the antique shop. She practically threw herself inside, her presence shaking the tiny room. The old shopkeeper looked up from behind the counter, and for the first time, Mika saw real fear in his face. Before he could speak, she yanked the kimono from her bag and slammed it down.
Take it back!
The shopkeeper recoiled as if she had thrown a corpse onto his counter. His lips trembled.
You touched it.
His voice was barely a whisper.
It won't let go now.
Mika's pulse pounded in her ears.
Burn it!
The old man flinched. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, gaze flickering between her and the kimono.
It's not the kimono that burns.
A chill spidered down Mika's spine. She shook her head violently.
No, you don't understand. I saw...
Her words died in her throat. Because the kimono, it was different. When she had pulled it from her bag, it had been the same pale, tattered thing as before. But now, the fabric looked fresh, smooth, almost pulsing. The crimson chrysanthemums had darkened, no longer faded with time. No, not darkened, wettened. The petals weren't dyed. They were soaked. A single drop of deep red slid from the sleeve, soaking into the wood. And then, a soft, wet squelch, like something inside the fabric had shifted. The shopkeeper took a step back.
It's almost ready.
Mika's body locked. Her skin went ice cold.
What?
The old man's eyes were hollow, distant.
It needed warmth. It needed time. But now...
Slowly, his gaze drifted over her shoulder.
Now, it just needs flesh.
A hot, rancid breath grazed Mika's ear. Her veins turned to ice. She knew what she would see if she turned around. She knew. And still, the light in the shop flickered, and behind her, the wet sound of feet on wood. Mika didn't turn around. She couldn't. She felt it. Felt her. The presence loomed behind her, too close, too real. The air was thick, humid, wrong. A rancid organic heat slithered against her spine, and beneath it, the faintest pressure, fingers barely grazing the back of her neck. Then, a whisper. Mika ran. She didn't think. Her body just moved. She crashed through the door, stumbling into the dimming daylight, her legs weak beneath her. Somewhere behind her, she heard the old man muttering prayers. But it was too late. She had taken it. She had worn it. She had fed it. And now, it was coming with her. She didn't stop running until she reached her rented room. She locked the door, bolted the windows, but she already knew it wouldn't help. Her body felt different. Her skin ached. She ripped off her sweater, gasping, desperate for air, and froze. Her reflection in the mirror, her arms, her chest, her shoulders. Her skin was changing. The flesh beneath her collarbone was paler, smoother, the pores unnaturally fine. The texture was different, thinner, softer, like silk, like fabric. She whimpered, clutching at herself, her nails digging deep, too deep. The skin shifted, the color darkened, not bruising, not wounds, patterns, chrysanthemums, red, blooming from the inside. A violent tremor racked her body. She stumbled back. The mirror shuddered, and then a new reflection. Not hers. Aiko, standing inside the glass. Her hacked, uneven hair clung to her wet, flayed skin. the gleam of exposed muscle, the glistening black holes where her eyes should have been. She smiled. Her lips barely moved, but Mika heard her. "Your turn." Mika's breath hitched, her vision blurred, the mirror cracked, and her skin ripped. The next week, a young woman arrived in Nagaoka, eager to study traditional textiles. She wandered into a quiet little antique shop at the end of an alley, its scent heavy with dust and something fleshy. On a rack in the corner, she found a kimono unlike any other. The silk was pale, soft as skin. The pattern, a field of deep red chrysanthemums. She ran her fingers over the fabric. It was warm, and then a breath.